Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize to you, but we had historic guests visiting the committee today. We are moving at a rapid pace to try to construct our historic legislation that matches the quality of the witnesses which we have appearing before us. On this next panel, we have a group of nationally recognized experts in their subject area, and we are going to begin with Ian Bowles. Mr. Bowles is the Secretary of the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. He also served as Associate Director of the White House Council on Environmental Quality and Senior Director of the Global Environmental Affairs Directorate at the National Security Council. We welcome you, Mr. Bowles. And by the way, I will introduce all of you so you won't have to reintroduce yourself, which might save you 15 or 20 seconds in your testimonies. So whenever you're ready, Mr. Bowles, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for the terrific work in this legislation. I'm sure as you stare at this panel, it feels like Heartbreak Hill in the Boston Marathon. So I commend you for your patience in these proceedings, and thank you for having us here today. Let me say at the outset, Mr. Chairman, that Governor Patrick and the work we've been doing on clean energy is very much aligned with the legislation that you and your team have produced, and we appreciate the thoughtful approach to developing a federal-state partnership that advances the goals of clean energy and greenhouse gas reduction. I also want to note that many states have been leading in this area for recent years, and we all welcome this important legislation. In short, the legislation builds on, buttresses, and accelerates, but doesn't supplant proven state programs on energy efficiency and renewable energy. On energy efficiency, the bill creates a strong new set of federal standards, but also recognizes that much of the retail work retrofitting will be done and implemented at state and local levels. On renewable energy, the legislation recognizes the regional diversity of clean power solutions and the fundamentally regional nature of electricity markets and the need to bolster, not eliminate, such markets. And on transmission, I think it carefully resists the call for some top-down central planning that would disrupt competitive energy markets such as we have in the Northeast, and instead creates a market-based set of mandates that in our view is a superior way to accelerate renewable energy. And on regulation of greenhouse gases, the bill rightfully crafts a unified, robust national program, but it still leaves the states tools to innovate and continue to contribute to low-carbon solutions. As you consider the design of the cap-and-trade program, we in Massachusetts endorse a 100% auction approach. No other system provides the clarity and simplicity to the private sector, and it also allows the federal government, acting on behalf of the public interest, to put the proceeds to work to mitigate economic and consumer impacts, accelerate renewable energy and energy efficiency, and realign our public transportation infrastructure. Let me say in the case of our experiment with RGGI in the Northeast, our permit auctions have run smoothly, and we're putting tens of millions of dollars to work, creating jobs, and reducing energy costs for our consumers. As you consider a transition to the federal program, we believe such programs are needed and should be funded, not just for the RGGI states, but for all 50 states. And the federal recovery legislation begins that process with the state energy program funding. As you develop your priorities for spending auction proceeds, we really strongly encourage the committee to put a big push on energy efficiency and make it a large part of your investment. The proposed energy efficiency resource standard also represents a complementary tool to accomplish this. In Massachusetts, we have restructured our electricity market so that efficiency now competes with power generation on price to meet the load demand. The EERS would create a similar mandate for other states. For those who say the EERS may be too stringent, I would note that in Massachusetts, we have met through measures over the last decade 8% of our load through energy efficiency investments. In rough terms, that would be equivalent to the 2017 mandate in your legislation. So I encourage the committee to include robust measures on energy efficiency, and I would encourage you also to add some more significant measures on monitoring and verification so that we can demonstrate to the public what these investments in energy efficiency are producing. On building codes, I think the work based on the IECC and the ASHRAE standards is terrific. We in Massachusetts are building our new code currently on the 2009, not 2006 code, and I encourage the committee to look closely at the 2009 code, potentially as the basis. On transportation, the bill breaks new ground by incorporating greenhouse gas standards for vehicle emissions and transportation planning. I encourage the committee to go further even by tying federal highway funds to greenhouse gas reductions, consider incentives for vehicle mile traveled reductions, and give the states some flexibility to set and enforce greenhouse gas targets. On fuels, the proposal in legislation is a transition to the renewable fuel standard, to transition that standard into a low-carbon fuel standard. We think that's the right policy. If anything, we'd encourage you to move the timeline more quickly, but also to recognize some of the regional opportunities and the special considerations, such as we have in the Northeast, where we don't want to have leakage out of transportation fuels into things like home heating oil. In a related vein, we fully support the higher efficiency standards for appliances, especially the provision that allows states to set more stringent standards where conditions warrant. As you may know, in the Commonwealth, we have a state law that requires furnace efficiency standards for cold weather states. We think there's some important regional differences there. In sum, I would say this is a terrific piece of legislation. We commend you and your staff for your hard work on it, and I'd be delighted to take the committee's questions. Thank you,
Mr. Secretary, very much. Our next witness, Dave McCurdy, is a former extremely distinguished member of the United States Congress, former chairman of the Intelligence Committee, and he is now using all of those political skills and intelligence as the president and CEO for the Alliance for Automobile Manufacturers, and he was previously the president and CEO of the Electronic Industries Alliance. We welcome you back, Dave. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity, and Ranking Member Upton and Chairman Dingell. It's always a pleasure to be back. I would tell you I've chaired a lot of hearings in my career as well, but I'm not sure any would match the marathon of the last 4 days. So I commend you for your interest and your endurance, and I'd respectfully suggest that if there's only one thing you recall from my testimony today, just remember this, that automakers are committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the vehicles we sell and from our assembly plants. And today I'm going to focus on how we can work together to accomplish that. To begin with, the Alliance supports federal legislation for an economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions reduction program. We agree with the Chairman, Administrator Jackson, and others that a comprehensive legislative approach is superior to regulating greenhouse gas under the existing Clean Air Act. When we look ahead and envision what a low-carbon future for automobiles will look like, here's what we see. It's going to require substantial investment in advanced vehicle technologies. Secondly, our country needs complementary policies for fuels. And third, we need a single national program for improving fuel economy and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Let me start with investment in technologies. Providing clean energy necessary for continued economic and growth and prosperity will require rapid development and commercial scale deployment of advanced technology across many sectors, including motor vehicles. We strongly urge the committee to use revenues generated from the proposed cap and trade system to help fund research, development, and implementation of new technologies and upgrading and retooling of manufacturing facilities to provide the next generation of green vehicles. According to the endangerment finding released by EPA last week, light-duty vehicles, cars, trucks, and SUVs that we drive, account for around 17% of man-made greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. In order to realize the significant reductions we know we will have to achieve in our sector, we need sizable, sustained investments to take advanced low-carbon vehicle technologies from our laboratories to our customers' garages. Front-loading investments in these technologies is particularly critical for automakers given the long lead times to develop new technologies, the extended periods needed to ramp up production of new technologies, and the long-lived nature of our products. Given the importance of this sector, we urge at least 5% of annual allowance value, either in the form of allowances or revenue, be dedicated specifically to development and deployment of advanced technologies for light-duty vehicles. We're open to further discussions with the committee on how to allocate such resources among manufacturers, suppliers, and consumers. With regard to fuels, the draft bill's approach of capping emissions primarily upstream at the fuel source allows for the broadest possible coverage and also will result in price signals at the rate of about 8.5 cents, 8.5 cents per gallon of gasoline for every $10 ton of carbon. Clean vehicles need clean fuels. So the Alliance supports a low-carbon fuel standard, such as the one included in Section 121 of the draft. Lowering the carbon content of the fuels we put into our fuel tanks will help lower greenhouse gas emissions from the fuel source to our tailpipes for years to come. And the benefits of cleaner fuels can be realized by all the 250 million autos on the road today. Finally, a key concern for automakers is that we not be subject to duplicative and incompatible state and federal regulatory approaches, either for mobile sources or stationary sources. It is well known that the Alliance strongly supports a single national program for motor vehicle greenhouse gas emissions and fuel economy to bridge state and federal programs. We support the author's efforts to clarify the roles of the existing regulatory framework and the states with regard to our manufacturing facilities. We will continue to work constructively with Congress, the administration, and all other stakeholders to ensure a national vehicle program administered by the federal government that not only enhances energy security and addresses climate change, but also gives automakers a clear roadmap to compliance. Before I close, I wanted to raise one other issue that is important to members of this committee. Last month, President Obama pointed to a fleet modernization or so-called cash for clunkers programs that have been successful in Europe, and he announced he would work with Congress to fund a program from existing dollars in the Recovery Act. The Alliance welcomes presidential as well as congressional support for a fleet modernization program. We will continue working towards creating a program available to all manufacturers and consumers. A well-crafted fleet modernization program will deliver two important benefits. In the near term, it will stimulate auto sales during the current economic credit crisis, and in the long term, it will help replace older, less fuel-efficient vehicles with cleaner, safer, more fuel-efficient ones. In closing, Mr. Chairman, the transition to a new way of using energy and new energy sources requires that we collaborate with government and other industries like never before. The next generation of vehicles will require a new generation of fuels and supporting infrastructure. You have our commitment to continue reinventing the automobile. We will continue to provide Americans with a wide range of vehicles that are highly fuel efficient, and we will be at the leading edge of the world's low-carbon economy, an economy in which green auto jobs are a fundamental part of the engine driving our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave, very much. Our next witness, Mr. Alan Ruther, is the Legislative Director for the International Union of the United Auto Workers. He is a member of one of the most aristocratic automotive families in the history of our country, and we're honored to have you with us today, sir. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to be here on behalf of the UAW, which represents over 1 million active and retired members, many of whom work for or receive retirement benefits from the auto manufacturers and parts suppliers. We appreciate the opportunity to testify before this subcommittee. The UAW supports the provisions of Title II establishing an economy-wide cap-and-trade program to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We welcome the inclusion of mechanisms to contain costs. However, we believe the provisions in Title IV that seek to preserve the competitiveness of domestic industries need to be strengthened in a number of ways. For example, these provisions should be expanded to include products such as auto parts that contain large amounts of energy-intensive materials. Most importantly, the UAW believes a substantial amount of the revenues from the auction of carbon allowances should be used to help auto manufacturers and parts companies with the major upfront costs associated with meeting tougher vehicle efficiency standards. This includes at least another $25 billion to fund the existing Section 136 Advanced Technology Vehicles Manufacturing Incentive Program, as well as funds for the new program that may be established under Section 124 of Title I. In addition, revenues should be used to pay for other costs associated with meeting tougher vehicle efficiency standards beyond those linked to advanced technology vehicles. Because of their current difficult financial situations, the Detroit-based automakers and many parts suppliers do not have the resources to make the necessary investments. The UAW also supports the clean fuels and vehicles provisions in Title I of the discussion draft. The low-carbon fuel standard can make a major contribution to reducing our nation's consumption of oil and greenhouse gas emissions. The provisions supporting large-scale demonstrations of electric vehicles can create demand for the production of these vehicles. And the provisions in Section 124 granting financial support to automakers to retool plants to build plug-in electric drive vehicles in this country can accelerate the introduction of these vehicles, but also ensure that they will be produced in the United States by American workers. The UAW applauds the transportation planning requirements in Title II, which recognize that initiatives to reduce vehicle miles traveled must be an important part of any effort to reduce oil consumption and greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. Although the light-duty vehicle efficiency provisions in Title II take the commendable step of calling for the harmonization of standards that may be set by NHTSA, EPA, and the State of California, they do not purport to establish any minimum benchmark for such standards beyond 2015. Instead, they merely provide a green light for subsequent regulatory action by the State of California. The UAW believes this approach has several deficiencies. It fails to provide any certainty that there will be guaranteed minimum improvements in vehicle efficiency over an extended period of time, and it fails to provide automakers with certainty as to what will be required of them. In lieu of this approach, the UAW submits that it would be preferable to mandate minimum national harmonized vehicle efficiency standards that must be met by the automakers for specified dates extending through 2030. These could be set as specific MPG targets or as percentage improvements from a certain baseline. The UAW recognizes that this alternative approach would have to embody a negotiated agreement between NHTSA, EPA, and the State of California, as well as other stakeholders. This could reflect the desire of California for more stringent reductions in vehicle emissions and oil consumptions. However, we believe it also should reject some of the deficiencies in California law AB 1493, including the exemption of foreign automakers, the one-size-fits-all flat MPG approach, and the lack of any anti-backsliding rule. Under the alternative approach that we are suggesting, the legislation could specify that it is not altering existing law regarding the authority of California and other states after the end date of any negotiated agreement on a harmonized national vehicle efficiency standard. In conclusion, the UAW appreciates the opportunity to testify before this subcommittee. We look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, and the other members of the committee and the entire Congress to craft improved provisions relating to vehicle efficiency standards and providing the resources needed by automakers and parts suppliers to meet new efficiency standards. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ruther, very much. Our next witness is Dr. Dan Sperling. Dr. Sperling is the founding director of the Institute of Transportation Studies at the University of California, Davis. He was appointed to the automotive engineering seat on the California Air Resources Board by Governor Schwarzenegger and served as co-director of the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard Study. We welcome you, Dr. Sperling.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's a special pleasure because I bring important news on the Low Carbon Fuel Standard from California. Last night, the California Air Resources Board made history. We voted to adopt the Low Carbon Fuel Standard. It will take effect in January 2011. It requires a 10% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions per unit of energy for gasoline and diesel fuel by 2020. And I note that 11 other states have signed MOUs to also adopt the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, and that the European Union is also moving toward adopting policies that closely resemble a low-carbon fuel standard. So I would like to point out that there are a number of reasons why the U.S. should follow California's lead and adopt a low-carbon fuel standard. One, it applies to all potential transportation fuels, unlike the current renewable fuel standard that Congress passed in 2007, which only applies to biofuels. Another feature is the emissions are measured on a life cycle basis, and this is the scientifically correct way to regulate greenhouse gases, to include all the emissions in the energy chain, from the oil well, the coal mine, or the cornfield, all the way to the vehicle. Neither cap and trade nor the Renewable Fuel Standards Program are based on life cycle measurements. Another key feature is it uses a performance standard, not volumetric mandates, as is the case with the Renewable Fuel Standard. And thus, it allows industry and it allows customers to pick the winners. The winners are not picked, and the losers are not picked by government in this case. It harnesses market forces to stimulate innovation. The low-carbon fuel standard allows the energy providers to buy and sell credits amongst each other, creating a market for these low-carbon fuel standard credits and reducing the overall cost of developing low-carbon fuels. And so what it's doing is it's creating a durable, permanent framework for orchestrating the transition to low-carbon alternative fuels. The history of alternative fuels is one of ad hoc, short-lived policy actions. We've seen policymakers in the media jump from one solution to another, from synfuels to methanol to battery electrics to hydrogen to corn ethanol, and now the fuel du jour, the technology du jour is plug-in hybrids. We need a more permanent policy framework that sends consistent signals to industry and consumers and that doesn't pick winners. And very importantly, it also achieves both energy security and climate goals. And I would note that producers of oil sands complain that they will be put out of business with a low-carbon fuel standard. And this is just not true. The low-carbon fuel standard does not preclude any fuel. Rather, it provides an incentive to produce fuels more efficiently and with less carbon. And indeed, senior oil executives have indicated to me that with sufficient incentive, they could make gasoline from oil sands with less greenhouse gas emissions than gasoline from conventional oil. And lastly, a low-carbon fuel standard reduces oil price volatility, and it caps petroleum price increases. So the proposed national LCFS is modeled on the California low-carbon fuel standard, but it has two differences. First is that the proposed national standard in this bill does not include biofuels until 2023. It assumes that the renewable fuel standard enacted in the ACES of 2007 will handle the biofuels until then. The result is that until 2023, the national low-carbon fuel standard only targets petroleum and non-biofuel options, mostly electricity, natural gas, and hydrogen. Failure to integrate the renewable fuel standard into the low-carbon fuel standard until 2023 is problematic. Keeping the biofuels separate from other alternative fuels reduces the flexibility of the market to respond to the targets, and it also reduces incentives to produce the very lowest carbon fuels. So unlike the renewable fuel standard, the low-carbon fuel standard provides incentives for continuous improvements. The other difference, the second important difference between the two, is that the national standard has more modest targets. The California low-carbon fuel standard has a target of 10% reduction in greenhouse gases per unit of energy by 2020, with further reductions to follow. The national one sets a target of 0% improvement until 2022, and then in 2023, when the RFS and the biofuels are folded in, it jumps to 5%, but it's still considerably less, and then it goes to 10% in 2030. I would argue for higher targets. Okay, so just so the recommendation, just very quickly, the RFS should be integrated into the national LCFS as soon as possible. Targets should be more aggressive, and the federal program should not preempt the state programs. But the priority is adopt this low-carbon fuel standard. It's a good idea, and even in a limited fashion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sperling, very much. Our next witness, David Friedman, is the Research Director of the Clean Vehicles Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Mr. Friedman has served on 3 major committees for the National Academy of Sciences covering fuel economy, fuel-efficient tires, and fuel cell vehicles. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, members of the committee, for the opportunity to testify before you today. I'd also like to thank you specifically for your leadership on fuel economy. That was the important first step on transportation. But now, as we look to where we need to go from here, the discussion draft before us represents the essential next step. And as my testimony will show, the transportation system can go much farther than the progress delivered under the 2007 Energy Bill. What America needs is a comprehensive approach that addresses transportation as a system of vehicles, fuels, and infrastructure, and a strong cap that covers all parts of the economy, including transportation. We released a 2-year peer-reviewed study on Wednesday before the full committee. Our Climate 2030 blueprint demonstrates the need for a well-designed cap-and-trade system and a comprehensive set of policies for the energy and transportation sectors. With this approach, we can accumulate $1.6 trillion in savings through 2030. Let me say that again. We can save money while tackling climate change. Now, if we remove some of the complementary policies, we will still save $600 billion, but it will go down. These complementary policies are essential to saving money while addressing climate change. Now, the results of our study highlight that the draft bill will also require significant action by the administration to make these policies work. For example, the Environmental Protection Agency will need to set strong global warming emission standards for all vehicles and off-road equipment. There are opportunities to save money and cut carbon emissions from every vehicle, every ship, every plane. The EPA must also protect and defend state authority to help bring about cleaner cars and fuels in recognition both of the unique circumstances in those states and the history of leadership on these issues from California and many others. Thanks in large part to California and the states that have supported its efforts, cars and trucks today are 90% cleaner when it comes to smog than those sold 40 years ago. So I believe that EPA can head a partnership with states and with NHTSA that provides the clarity and certainty that automakers need. Now, automakers that don't invest in this future and in these clean and efficient technologies will be left by the side of the road. But as a result of this, in these hard economic times, it does make sense for the federal government to help the auto industry. However, taxpayers deserve a return on their investment, a requirement that automakers at least meet nationwide the same global warming emission standards adopted by California and 14 other states. That said, we must not put all the responsibility on the auto industry. Oil companies and fuel providers must step up, and that is why EPA will also need to make a transition from a renewable fuel standard that covers only 10% of today's transportation fuels to a low-carbon fuel standard that covers all fuels and counts all direct and indirect emissions. State, local governments, and everyone who drives must also step up. The Department of Transportation will have to build on their plans to develop a smarter transportation, working with local governments to help get people where they need to go with fewer miles and less pollution. This will require investments in transit and support for pay-per-mile programs that will keep our roads and bridges repaired. EPA also has a significant role to play here in setting up standards to evaluate local transportation plans. But there must also be consequences associated with making and meeting effective plans. Finally, we need our scientists and engineers to step up and to deliver on the promise of fuel cell, plug-in, and battery electric vehicles and the lowest carbon fuels. If Congress and the administration step up to the plate, the UCS Climate 2030 blueprint shows that the United States can cut carbon emissions from cars and light trucks to 40% below 2005 levels by 2030. we can hold carbon emissions from freight trucks steady despite an 80% growth in the economy through 2030. At the same time, we can deliver net annual savings of $120 billion to consumers and businesses in 2030 alone. Consumers specifically will save about $580 per household per year. We're not talking about how much it will cost. We're talking about how much money they will save as a result of cutting global warming emissions. Now, by 2030, we will also have additional benefits. We can reduce transportation's addiction to oil by more than 3 million barrels per day, more than we currently import from the entire Persian Gulf region. And this is all on top of the benefits that you helped deliver through the 2007 energy bill. When you look at today's economy and the prospect of rising gas prices and rising carbon emissions, once we beat this recession, we simply cannot afford to ignore this opportunity to invest in a cleaner transportation future and the jobs that investment will create.
Thank you, Mr. Friedman, very much. And our next witness is Mr. David Gardner. He is the founder and president of David Gardner and Associates, energy and climate consulting firm. He previously served as the executive director of the White House Climate Change Task Force during the Clinton administration. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This morning, Congressman Butterfield asked a question about what he could say to his low-income consumers in his district about this broad legislation. And we believe that a key part of the answer to that question is we're going to deliver a lot more energy efficiency to you, and particularly as contained in your discussion draft, we should adopt an energy efficiency resource standard. An energy efficiency resource standard, as in your bill, Mr. Chairman, would require utility companies to deliver increasing amounts of energy efficiency to their customers. Specifically, that we would deliver 15% more energy efficiency by 2020 in the electricity area and 10% for natural gas. With this requirement, which we have in place in 19 states already today, what utility companies do is to turn around and offer rebates to their customers for investing in energy efficiency appliances and making energy efficient homes. Colorado, for example, has just adopted a standard, and the utility there, Xcel, has recently launched 2 programs to offer rebates to home builders because it's cheaper for Colorado to pay for a more efficient home than it is to build a power plant to serve that. Now, under your draft discussion bill, Mr. Chairman, this provision for an energy efficiency resource standard saves consumers $170 billion by 2020. It's exactly the kind of thing that Congressman Butterfield is looking for his low-income consumers. It also creates 220,000 new net jobs, because there's a lot of jobs out there making homes more energy efficient and building more energy efficient appliances. It also will avoid the equivalent of 48 million automobiles worth of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, there are some who've suggested that what we should do is to merge the energy efficiency resource standard with a renewable electricity standard. That's an unwise path because that will lead to less energy efficiency and it will increase consumer costs. Our own analysis indicates that could be as much as a $70 billion increase for consumers. On the converse side, the energy efficiency resource standard and the renewable electricity standard actually lower the costs of meeting a cap on carbon dioxide, and they do so by approximately 15%. They do it because they eliminate the barriers that are out there for cost-effective investments in energy efficiency. The chief barrier to that is that in most states in the country, electric utility companies lose money if there are significant investments, that they make significant investments in energy efficiency. So an energy efficiency resource standard turns that around and makes energy efficiency a profitable venture for electric utility companies and starts to deliver the kinds of savings that consumers are going to want to need and can be an important component of making sure that the achievement of our greenhouse gas reductions is done at the lowest possible cost. So we urge the committee to not only retain the discussion draft provision on the energy efficiency resource standard, but to make sure that we move forward as rapidly as possible to get this in place, because energy efficiency is a resource that we can start taking advantage of today. We can start saving consumers money today, and we can start creating those jobs in the energy efficiency field today. So it's urgent that the Congress move forward with adopting the energy efficiency resource standard. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gardner, and your testimony was consistent with your energy philosophy. You yielded back 1 minute to us, and we appreciate really a great gift to us today. Our next witness, Mr. Jeff Genzer, Mr. Jeff Genzer, is counsel for the National Association of State Energy Officials. Mr. Genzer, we welcome you, and whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The energy efficiency programs within the bill are solid, and we generally support them. I won't focus on the appliance provision since Mr. Dulaski will be discussing that. Number one, NASIO supports specific 30% increases in both residential and commercial building energy codes and standards. These should be federal and mandatory and need to happen quickly. The residential code should be adopted and effective on January 1, 2010, which represents a 30% increase over the 2006 International Energy Conservation Code. It has become clear to state energy officials that the residential consensus code process has become dominated by interests that refuse to recognize the role that new homes play in energy use and climate change, and that seek to maintain the status quo despite the very acceptable costs, in fact, cost reductions for consumers of moving to much more efficient buildings. On the commercial side, ASHRAE should be given an opportunity to achieve a 30% commercial building standard increase over ASHRAE 90.1 2004. However, it needs to be effective on January 1, 2011. We cannot achieve our energy and climate goals without this. We have waited far too long already. We simply cannot accept the ridiculous argument that it is never a good time to raise energy-efficient building codes. Never good in flush times, never good in bad times. Homeowners live in these homes and consume energy for a century. Every day we wait is another day of dollars out the pockets of homeowners and taxpayers. The cost of achieving the same gains in energy efficiency is an order of magnitude higher when we retrofit than during the initial construction. Funding will be required for states and local governments to conduct compliance, training, and enforcement. The only possible source is at the federal level, but we would maintain that the national interest in reducing the 10% share of global greenhouse gas emissions that comes through our buildings warrants that federal investment. Two, we support the Retrofit for Energy and Environmental Performance program that was sponsored by Representative Welch. It will lead to significant increases in energy efficiency for homeowners, commercial buildings, and public buildings. This will lead to local jobs, putting building contractors back to work, and it will produce real energy savings for real people and return dollars to communities. Third, we support the rebate program to get homeowners out of the older, pre-1976 manufactured housing. We support the program sponsored by Representative Barron Hill. Number four, we support a building energy performance labeling program. We don't understand why anyone engaged in helping Americans make wise decisions when owning, operating, buying, or selling a building would reject an effort to allow consistent, comprehensive, and understandable information about that building's energy consumption to be readily and indeed publicly available. Fifth, most state energy offices support an energy efficiency resource standard, but want to ensure that state-administered programs will be allowed to continue. Six, the State Energy and Environmental Development Fund, the SEED Fund, included in the bill, is another positive program and would provide a good overlay for energy and environmental program initiatives. We look forward to working with the subcommittee and the committee in examining these programs. A number of items that have been discussed and will be discussed at these hearings are certainly worth including. Commissioner Grunich discussed yesterday a proposal on state planning. Bill Becker will be on the next panel. From NACA, he'll be discussing our desire to avoid state preemption and permit states to run programs on the environmental side that are more robust than the federal program. Third, Representative Van Hollen made a good proposal for a federal energy loan bank. While it is a good idea at the local level, we're concerned that it'll be very difficult for the Department of Energy, despite Secretary Chu's monumental efforts to get their loan program going at DOE, to run it from the federal level. I want to, in my 19 seconds left, mention to Congressman Baldwin that my daughter is a junior at Wisconsin, and I have a rising freshman.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Excellent. We thank you, Mr. Genzer. And our next witness is Mr. Charles Drevna. He is the president of the National Petrochemical and Refiners Association. He has more than 35 years of experience in that field. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Upton and Congressman Baldwin. Thank you for having me here today. Addressing climate change requires realistic long-term strategies that recognize the vital role of all forms of energy, that all forms of energy will play in maintaining our country's security, economic strength, and quality of life. NPRA supports the advancement and deployment of new technologies that will bring reliable, affordable, and clean supplies of domestic energy to consumers. We do, however, have some serious concerns with the ability of the discussion draft, the American Clean Energy and Security Act of 2009, to achieve these goals, particularly in relationship to the transportation sector. My written statement focuses on 3 or 4 major topics of concern regarding the discussion draft, but rather than attempt to simply condense the written statement in the time allotted, I will briefly reiterate some specific areas of concern. These include the adoption of a low-carbon fuel standard. At best, the LCFS is redundant and overly costly. More likely, it's contradictory and punitive. We do not need the LCF if fuels are regulated under the cap through a scientifically achievable time frame. The compliance timeframes in the discussion draft are, in our opinion, again on the transportation sector, overly aggressive. Another area of concern is that the refining industry, we believe, and we hope to demonstrate, that the refining industry is indeed energy intensive and subject to international competition as composed to what the findings of the discussion draft state. And finally, we have some questions concerning the allocation of emission allowances. It seems to be a dearth of knowledge on how those will be handled in the discussion draft. Now, I anticipate that the committee will have questions regarding these items, and among others, and I look forward to discussing them with you. In the remaining time I have, I want to focus somewhat on links, a rather rudimentary description of the petroleum refining process, but one that it must be achieved in order to facilitate technological and commercial success is a rearrangement of the links between and among hydrocarbon molecules. It's been a very long time since refineries were described as structures that boil oil or simply are a bubble in the oil pipeline. Today's refineries are complex, sophisticated, state-of-the-art facilities that operate most efficiently while providing consumers with the reliable products that drive the nation's economy. From clean-burning gasoline, diesel, and home heating oil to the petrochemical feedstocks that are the building blocks for a multitude of products. Asphalt to aspirin, cosmetics to computers, heart valves to helmets, pharmaceuticals to patio furniture. The domestic refining industry is the linchpin for these products. Transforming various hydrocarbon molecules, again, rearranging the molecular links of the oil in a technologically advanced, environmentally sound, and economically viable fashion is vital to the success of the domestic refining industry and the overall economy it drives. There are more consequential links as well. The link between energy and economic strength for the entire nation, and the link between energy and American security. The question before this committee today, and ultimately for the entire nation, is, will the current draft of the American Clean Energy and Security Act of 2009 or similar legislation forge stronger, more viable links in these vital chains, or will doing so lead to adverse economic impacts, not on just the domestic refining industry, but on the nation's economy? The answer to these questions must be fully investigated, understood, and documented before enactment of any legislation. Most likely, we have but one chance to get it right. The nation simply can't afford anything short of a complete understanding. Lastly, the provisions of the draft legislation neglect to ensure one other link, the link between international participation and the ultimate success of the initiative. For example, and we've heard this over and over today, China continues to state that it will not participate in any program that restricts its emissions. International participation is a critical issue as we need, as we need to implement any program. 1 ton of CO2 emitted in Columbus, Ohio is indistinguishable from 1 ton emitted in Beijing, Mumbai, or Moscow. The possible consequences should determine the pace, or else the pace could determine the consequences. Mr. McCurdy stated that you good people have sat here for 4 days in a marathon, and I commend you for that. Again, I really commend you for that. But don't try to sprint to the finish line. Keep the marathon going. It's a marathon, not a sprint. We have to know everything before we can go forward. And to that extent, I would ask, do we have some more hearings on the transportation sector of this bill? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Delaski. I've been on the Energy Committee for 33 years, the Natural Resources Committee for 33 years, so that's 66 years of hearings that I've gone to. And the Speaker created a select committee on global warming and energy independence, and that gave me 3 more years of hearings that I've had on the subject. So I do think of it as a marathon. Believe me, most of these issues have been percolating around here for a long, long time. That much I can promise you. Our next witness is Mr. And I don't think anyone else is ever going to try it again, okay, go to the number of hearings I've gone to on these subjects. You can already see the effect that today's hearing has had on membership. Our next witness is
if the gentleman yield just for a second. I remember when Mr. Dingell had hearings like these, and he had coffee in front of everybody, and so they went maybe a little faster.
In many ways, they went a lot faster with that coffee in front of them. Mr. Andrew Delaski is the Executive Director of the Appliance Standards Awareness Project, a coalition dedicated to advancing cost-effective appliance and equipment efficiency standards. He's joining us here today from my home state of Massachusetts, so we welcome you, Mr. Delaski.
Thank you, Mr.
Yes, sir.
I have to leave. I have a flight out of back to California out of Dulles now. I'm really sorry.
No, and we apologize to you, Dr. Spurley, and by the way, to all of the witnesses and those who are accompanying our witnesses today. You could, I think, capture the intensity of interest which the members had in the questioning of Vice President Gore and Newt Gingrich. So it went for an unexpectedly long period of time, and it is with our apologies to you that we request that you work with us over the next month or so towards developing a bill which does reflect, the highest aspirations. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Again, back to you, Mr. Delaski. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just say a word about ASAP. ASAP is a coalition project which consists of representatives of energy efficiency advocacy organizations, environmental and consumer groups, including low-income advocacy organizations, state government, and utilities. Our mission, as you said, is to advance cost-effective energy efficiency standards for appliances, lighting, and equipment. My testimony today is limited to Subtitle B concerning the appliance and equipment standards in the bill. I'll summarize just a few key points from my in-depth testimony. Congress first enacted national appliance, equipment, and lighting standards in 1988, as Chairman Markey well knows, in legislation that you authored, and added new standards in 1992, 2005, and 2007. In general, Congress has established initial standards by statute and directed the Department of Energy to review standards on a set schedule, increasing to higher efficiency levels if shown to be technically feasible and economically justified. The American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, ACES, estimates that absent existing national standards, U.S. electricity use and peak electric demand would be about 10% higher in 2010 than currently projected. ACEE also estimates that consumers and businesses which buy the affected products will net more than $400 billion in net savings from these already existing standards. The enormous energy, environmental, and economic benefits delivered by national product efficiency standards have contributed to a history of strong, bipartisan support and cooperation for new standards and enhancements to the Department of Energy's program structure. The bill before us today builds on this successful history. We thank Chairman Waxman, Subcommittee Chairman Markey, for including the important appliance efficiency subtitle in ACES. The subtitle consists of 3 parts. Sections 211 and 212 enact specific new standards for 6 categories of products, including portable electric spas, as we learned earlier. Section 213 provides critical enhancements to improve overall effectiveness and responsiveness of the DOE program. And Sections 214 and 215 relate to voluntary programs, including Energy Star. We estimate that the specific standards included in ACES will save at least 17 billion kilowatt hours annually by 2020, or roughly enough to meet the needs of 1.5 million typical U.S. households. The standards included in the bill would reduce power sector carbon dioxide emissions by about 12 million metric tons per year in 2020. I'd like to especially call out the outdoor lighting standard initially introduced by Representative Harmon. This standard offers the lion's share of the savings from the specific standards in the bill. Discussions between members of the industry and efficiency proponents that I work with are ongoing and remain optimistic that we'll have further joint recommendations to present to you shortly on outdoor lighting. The program reforms in ACES are just as important as the specific efficiency standards. As we have gained experience with DOE rulemakings through the course of several administrations, we've learned of some of the shortcomings of the statutory structure which can stand in the way of cost-effective efficiency gains. The bill contains several important reforms which address some of these shortcomings. Now, I'll highlight just 2, but we support the entire package of reforms for the Department of Energy's program. The 2 that I highlight. First, ACES, the bill makes clear the DOE authority to apply more than one efficiency metric as part of a single product's efficiency standard. While Congress has set more than one requirement for at least a dozen products in statute, DOE has recently held that the law prevents the agency from including more than one requirement per product. Often a standard for a given product must include more than one element to capture different aspects of the product's efficiency, for example, energy and water efficiency, gas and electric efficiency, in the case of a furnace, which uses both gas and electricity, or to capture the cost-effective savings from controls or other technologies that are not reflected in a product's test method. For example, successful application of smart grid technology and demand response technology may depend on specific appliances, including particular control features. Such features are typically not represented in a performance test method, but may be a critical feature of future energy efficiency standards. The Department's current interpretation of the law will prevent this sort of requirement in future appliance standards. This provision passed the House in 2007, and we strongly urge you to act on it again. Another area I'd like to highlight concerns the preemption limits that national standards place on state building codes. House and Senate energy bills have proposed federal targets of 30% savings in new buildings in the near term and 50% savings later through better building codes. However, the preemption associated with national appliance standards effectively puts savings from space and water heating and air conditioning off limits, even when such savings may be very cost-effective for new construction and major renovations. The discussion draft will create new flexibility for state building codes while still preserving a basic structure, a basic federal preemption framework. There are several other program reforms which we also support. Suffice to say that as a package, these reforms significantly strengthen the National Appliance Standards Program and will pave the way for greater energy savings and benefits. Finally, with respect to the voluntary programs, we're concerned that the limits in Section 215, which are placed on the Energy Star program, would make some of the existing Energy Star programs, home furnaces and other products, would end those programs. So we urge that section be modified. In sum, we support the subtitle and look forward to working with the committee to make it even better.
Thank you, Mr. Dulesky, very much. And our final witness is Mr. Dwight Sonny Richardson, He is the chairman of the National Association of Home Builders Construction Codes and Standards Committee. He is also president of Richardson Home Builders in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Please begin when you are ready, Mr. Richardson. Please hit the
Sorry about that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Upton, and Ms. Baldwin. Appreciate the opportunity to travel to Washington to discuss the energy bill, the carbon cap bill, global climate change bill with you on behalf of the 200,000 members of the National Association of Home Builders, NAHB. As you well know, we in the home building industry are facing devastating times in addition to the environmental and energy challenges facing our country. From building 2 million homes in 2006, we expect to construct less than 500,000 this year nationwide. Nonetheless, amidst the worst housing downturn since the Great Depression, I can personally attest to the strides our industry has made in energy efficiency and sustainability for our nation's new homes. According to the Energy Information Administration, newer homes, those built since 1991, account for only 2.5% of all energy consumed nationally. Our industry has pioneered the development of the only National Green Building Standard approved by the American National Standards Institute and has invested millions in an industry-transforming green building program, saving both energy and natural resources. Drawing on my lifetime of experience, I am a second-generation home builder, in the construction field, I believe that some of the policy approaches put forth in the American Clean Energy Security Act draft are unlikely to produce the expected energy savings. In particular, the provisions in Section 201 aggressively increase energy targets for new homes, provide greater authority for the Department of Energy to modify codes, and give little flexibility to state or local areas with specific geographic and climatic conditions. Current language is problematic for a number of reasons. In the broadest sense, seeking significant savings from new homes, the smallest most energy efficient segment of the market misses the target. Increasing costs and reducing affordability for newer, more efficient homes adversely affects lower and moderate income families that spend the most as a percentage of income on energy. In some instances, the provisions in Section 201 exceed a number of successful programs, such as EPA's Energy Star for Homes and many green building programs, not just the new National Green Building Standard. Striving solely for small incremental savings without accommodation for the more robust sustainability framework of a green program means that the more environmentally sound green homes could be non-compliant with the targets outlined in Section 201, yet these homes have a smaller carbon footprint because of sustainable design and resource considerations not covered by energy codes alone. On the other hand, NAHB is pleased to see that Section 202 of the draft legislation provides resources to consumers to upgrade their existing homes and buildings. Equally pleased that Vice President Gore supports this path. This will direct the resources of the federal government at the largest consumer of energy in the residential sector, older homes. According to the Census Bureau, there are roughly 128 million homes in the U.S. today, and fully 74%, or 94 million, were built before the existence of modern energy codes. Home builders have done their part and are doing their part to make newer homes more efficient. Now the federal government can help to residents of existing homes continue to help to do their fair share to reduce energy consumption. Despite our economic challenges, our home building industry has voluntarily taken the initiative to develop a rigorous National Green Building Standard, continues to implement energy efficiency in new construction, and is working diligently to preserve housing and affordability for the next generation of green and energy efficient homes. NAHB supports improving energy efficiency in national model codes and participates, along with many others, in the development process of the International Code Council. Because codes, by their very nature, do not address all aspects of energy consumption and housing, NEHB hopes that Congress will carefully consider an integrated energy strategy for the residential sector. This includes many aspects beyond the reach of codes, such as equipment efficiency, occupant behavior, plug loads, and appliance choices. Our NHB members are stakeholders in both the building and energy efficiency industries. We look forward to working with the subcommittee to craft policies that effectively address the energy challenges facing our nation and housing. My written comments provide additional details on these points, as well as recommendations for changes to the draft legislation that the committee will soon consider. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today and testify on behalf of my National Association of Home Builders.
Thank you, Mr. Richardson, very much.